I wish, Miss Bennet, that you would not attempt to sketch my character at the present moment. I fear the performance would reflect no credit on either of us.
Hi, welcome to another video. A little change of scenery because Charlie the cat is sleeping on the desk in the other room where I've set up my new, albeit magnolia, video room. So I'm back in the office and hopefully you won't mind the ambience, bit of guitars in the background. Pulled the curtains, get the direct sunlight out of the way. Anyway, the video, Mr. Darcy. That's what we're tackling today. Now I want to give you Mr. Darcy from my perspective. So this isn't a detailed analysis in terms of how the world sees him. It's how I see Mr. Darcy. So bear with me and maybe you'll get some insights in the way that I've kind of got some insights. Let's get into it. So from the moment Mr. Darcy strides into the Assembly Hall at Meryton, aloof and unmoved by provincial gaiety, he becomes a figure ripe for censure, speculation, and the occasional withering side-eye. Yet to judge him solely on this first impression is, as Elizabeth Bennet learns herself, a perilous oversimplification. Beneath his proud demeanour lies not arrogance, but a man weathered by responsibility, wounded by betrayal, and weary of the world's motivations, which, in fairness, is pretty decent reason to scowl at strangers. Darcy's complex temperament is not the result of haphazard character growth, but of deliberate, premeditated construction. And it's evident that Austen had envisioned his history, his trials with Wickham, his role as guardian to Georgiana, and his connections to Bingley and his social milieu, long before the first pages were penned. The foreknowledge allows her to unveil him gradually, revealing layers that are at once believable and compelling. Now, her genius lies in the subtle orchestration of detail, allowing Darcy's transformation to emerge organically while never compromising the integrity of his character. Such literary foresight underscores Austen's mastery in rendering not just a hero, but a wholly human soul, complete with impeccable tailoring and questionable people skills.
Come, you'd much better dance.
I certainly shall not. An assembly such as this, it would be insupportable.
Now, I may be entirely wrong in this analysis. Perhaps Darcy is simply a rich, haughty, land-owning gentleman whom everyone is justified in disliking. But if Jane Austen intended us to weigh his actions in light of his past, then it is undeniably astute of her to construct his character with such care and delay the revelations I am about to explore. She doesn't hand us his inner workings at once, but instead invites us to uncover them ourselves. So in the first instance, we have to consider the defining shadows of Darcy's past, the scandalous near elopement of his sister Georgiana with none other than George Wickham.
Georgiana.
This has left an indelible mark upon Darcy's judgment. It's not just pride that causes Darcy to appear cold and disdainful towards strangers, it is caution. Wickham, once a companion of his youth, proved himself treacherous, attempting not merely to seduce Georgiana, but to exploit her fortune. Such disloyalty, experienced so intimately, has rendered Darcy reluctant to allow new acquaintances into his inner circle. To him, outward charm is a veil too easily worn by those with darker intentions. He is in many ways a closed book now, its pages sealed by experience. And it is unlikely that anyone would get beyond a polite nod or greeting without first proving themselves trustworthy. We have evidence of this from Darcy's own words when he's speaking with Elizabeth at Netherfield, because he tells her,
"My good opinion once lost is lost forever."
Now this speaks volumes to me, as it indicates his hope for loyalty in friendship, and once that trust is broken, it's unredeemable. Words spoken from a man who has a scarred past, but is not willing to tell you why it's scarred. Elizabeth Bennet's spirited intelligence and frank observations pierce this reserve like particularly sharp bonnet pin. Her reproofs, first amused and later impassioned, challenged Darcy to confront the manner in which he navigates society.
I believe every disposition has a tendency to some particular evil.
Your defect is a propensity to hate everyone.
Well, yours is willfully to misunderstand them.
Her refusal at his first proposal, rich with wounded pride and ardent truth, acts as a mirror, showing him the fault in his guarded haughtiness. She says to him,
"The mode of your declaration merely spared me any concern I might have felt in refusing you had you behaved in a more gentlemanlike manner."
a line that reverberates in his conscience and becomes the hinge of his self-reckoning. Crucially, this moment also exposes a deeper misunderstanding, shaped by the rigid social codes of the time. Darcy assumes, much like Mr. Collins, bless him, that his offer will be welcomed, and he does so without offering any proof of his worth to Elizabeth, without unveiling the depth of his affection or character. And this is a critical failing. It's as though his inner voice is crying out, "I'm a good man," yet he has shown her none of the evidence. Their previous cordial meeting at Hunsford may have misled him, encouraging false confidence in her acceptance. And so in the arc of his character, we witness a remarkable transformation. Not in temperament, for Darcy remains a private and serious man, but in humility and grace. He evolves not out of submission, but out of respect and affection, a testament to his ability to grow beyond his own prejudice and, more impressively, to admit he was wrong. Whilst Darcy remains guarded in who he allows into his inner circle, one character who definitely is trusted is his companion, Mr. Bingley. His friendship with Bingley may offer further illumination of his inner life. Though Austen offers little detail of its origins, it is not far-fetched to imagine they became acquainted during their years at Cambridge or Oxford, wherever they may have studied, a setting both appropriate and plausible for young gentlemen of their standing. In Bingley, Darcy perhaps finds a companion who tempers his own severity. Their bond is not one of equals. Darcy, the elder, sees himself perhaps as a guardian figure, much as he does with Georgiana. Their shared experiences of paternal loss may have drawn them together, reinforcing Darcy's instinct to protect and advise, even when such counsel, as in the matter of Jane Bennet, proves misguided. Yet there is a striking contrast when one considers Darcy's earlier relationship with George Wickham, a boy he grew up with and perhaps once trusted, only to become disillusioned as Wickham's character gradually reveals itself. Even before the attempted elopement with Georgiana, Darcy began to see the discrepancies between Wickham's charm and his integrity. Now, this betrayal likely deepened his appreciation for Bingley, whose cheerful honesty and lack of ulterior motives, especially in regards to Darcy's sister, stand in refreshing opposition. Bingley's unaffected sincerity may not only explain the warmth of Darcy's regard, but also offer a rare example of friendship unmarred by suspicion or deceit. But the figure of Mr. Wickham remains central to understanding Darcy's enduring suspicion. What is certain is that Darcy was deeply wronged, and that this wrong was compounded by Wickham's continued deceit, particularly in the calculated pursuit of young women with wealth and presumably a manageable chaperone situation. So as the story unfolds, a pivotal moment comes when the Bennet sisters are introduced to Wickham in Meryton by Mr. Denny, and Darcy and Bingley happen upon them while they're on horseback. To enforce Elizabeth's opinion of Darcy, we see that just as he appears to dismount his horse, he catches sight of Wickham. And this perhaps is the first time he's seen him since the attempted elopement of Georgiana. In this charged moment, Wickham attempts a civil greeting, but is met with a cold, steely stare of unspoken contempt. Elizabeth, observing this, interprets Darcy's reaction as ungentlemanly, unaware of the gravity of the shared history. This scene is rendered vividly in the BBC's 95 adaptation. Colin Firth fans, you know the one. And it underscores the complexity of Darcy's character, his guarded demeanour shaped by betrayal, misunderstood as arrogance by those who do not know the full truth. But this moment further cements Elizabeth's opinion of Darcy, and it is then mentioned when the soldiers take tea at Longbourn, where Wickham asks Elizabeth if she saw the way they greeted each other.
Yes, you're surprised. Perhaps you might have noticed the cold manner of our greeting.
I confess I did.
It's a defining example of how Austen uses subtle interactions to reveal the weight of the past upon the present behaviour. Mrs. Young, once Georgiana Darcy's chaperone, offers a chilling insight into the foundations of Darcy's guarded demeanour. Far from a mere negligent caretaker, she is a key conspirator in Wickham's plot to abscond with Georgiana. Her complicity inflicted a deep personal betrayal. When Darcy encounters her again, this time embroiled in Wickham's designs on Lydia Bennet, his response is not surprise, but grim certainty. He recognises her, and more importantly, he recognises the pattern. This repetition of deceit underscores a man who has learned, through pain, the dangerous ease in which trust can be exploited.
Mrs. Young.
It is this bitter earned clarity that guides his discreet but decisive intervention. Darcy does not act from impulse or chivalry, but from hard-earned discernment, shaped by memory and reinforced by pattern. A man who has studied the shadows and learned to navigate them without losing his integrity, which is more than can be said for most of the people he's forced to associate with. It's also telling that Darcy does not approach Mr. Bennet to resolve Lydia's disgrace, but instead deals with Mr. Gardiner in its entirety. Now, practicality may be part of the reasoning. Mr. Gardiner is in London, but it is also a mark of respect. Darcy has observed in Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner a quiet dignity and soundness that elevate them beyond their mercantile status. That he entrusts Mr. Gardiner with the delicate business of securing Lydia's marriage speaks to a subtle re-evaluation of social worth, one established in character, not in class.
Mr. Darcy, I really believe you take too much upon yourself.
I must insist on this, sir. I assure you that in this matter argument is fruitless.
It could also be noted that Darcy trusts the Gardiners. From their first meeting at Pemberley, he found them quite delightful and not at all overawed by his great wealth.
I remember running from Pemberley to Lambton as a boy almost every day in the horse-chestnut season. There was one very fine tree there, I remember.
On the green, by the smithy.
The very one.
In a way, Mr. Gardiner looked upon Darcy as an equal, a gentleman, despite Mr. Gardiner gaining his wealth through trade. But Darcy would well have perceived Elizabeth's attempt to catch him out by mentioning that Jane had stayed with the Gardiners whilst at Cheapside. Darcy doesn't flinch at all and continues the conversation, allowing Elizabeth's comment almost to evaporate into thin air.
Mrs. Gardiner is my aunt, Mr. Darcy. My sister Jane stayed at their house in Cheapside when she was lately in London.
Delighted to make your acquaintance, madam. Delighted, sir.
Now, I've often felt that this first meeting was also an indication that Darcy was improving socially. The 95 adaptation clearly shows Elizabeth's astonishment and quizzical look at his amiability and good nature. He really is trying hard to change despite his guarded history, which of course comes out over the few following days because of the letter that Elizabeth receives from Jane. Is it possible that Darcy could have remained single? I'm thinking that it might not have been unheard of for the time, but a man of great fortune, as explained by Jane Austen at the beginning of Pride and Prejudice, must be in want of a wife. We know this in real life when we think of Jane's father, the Reverend George Austen's third cousin, Thomas Knight. With no heir to inherit his estates and wealth, he adopts Jane's second eldest brother, Edward. So too then with Darcy. With his vast wealth and land, he would surely be expected to take a wife, if not for love, then for duty, to secure the future of the Darcy legacy. But what of his suitors in his social circle? There is, of course, Caroline Bingley, but Darcy's indifference towards her is obvious. It's impossible to miss, really. Despite her pretensions, there is no indication that he ever entertained the notion of courtship. That Caroline hovers with hope is more a product of her ambition than any encouragement on his part. Lady Catherine de Bourgh's assertion that Darcy was promised to her daughter is similarly flimsy.
The engagement between them is of a peculiar kind. From their infancy they have been intended for each other.
There's no evidence that the late Mrs. Darcy shared this ambition, and Darcy himself never acknowledges such a plan. At Rosings Park, he pays Anne no more attention than civility demands, reinforcing that his affections were never engaged there, although his patience, one suspects, was sorely tested. So it seems Darcy is not looking for a wife or for love. He's still reeling from the events involving his sister and Wickham, and he remains guarded, with perhaps love and matrimony being the last things on his mind. That is, of course, until he sees Elizabeth. Is it love at first sight? Possibly not, but it is, I believe, a jolt to his senses. After informing Bingley that he is in no humour to give consequence to young ladies who are slighted by other men, and declaring that Elizabeth merely tolerable, we get that now famous moment. Elizabeth walks past him, unbothered, unamused, completely unaware of what she's just stirred. And it's as if Darcy has glimpsed his future wife before he knows how to name the feeling. He doesn't say anything, but we see it. It's written in his face. It's like he wants to reach out and stop her. Not in a possessive way, but as if he's seen something essential. Of course, this is Regency England, and such behaviour would be utterly deplorable. But what's fascinating here is that Darcy, for all his status and stoicism, is suddenly struck silent. He doesn't approach her, and he doesn't engage her. He retreats into silence. I think this tells us everything. When you're truly taken by someone, you become emotionally undone. Words don't always come. You don't speak because you don't want to ruin the moment by saying the wrong thing. And I know I felt this before. Perhaps you have too. Now, the anthropologist Desmond Morris once wrote about how, by instinct, we can assess a person as a genetic match in a matter of seconds, which is likely why we find ourselves drawn to one person and not another. Some might call it finding a soulmate, but it's that near instant unconscious assessment that's so telling here. I wonder if Darcy experiences something like that in this moment. Not in the scientific sense, but in that quiet animal instinct that tells you this person matters. Not because she flatters him or fawns over him, but because she doesn't. She's just not dazzled. She's not chasing wealth. And in that brief moment, I think Darcy sees the kind of woman who will never pretend, never manipulate, and never flatter where flattery isn't earned. And for a man like Darcy, who has spent his adult life guarding against disingenuous intentions, that moment of genuine, uncalculated humanity, well, it may just be the most disarming thing of all. One of the more telling evolutions in Darcy's character, the change in his character arc, if you will, comes through the comparison between his first and second proposals to Elizabeth. The first, despite its passionate declarations,
My feelings will not be repressed. You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you.
mirrors Mr. Collins's infamous proposal in more ways than Darcy would likely care to admit. Both men approach Elizabeth with an air of condescension, assuming her gratitude rather than seeking her consent, and both emphasize the generosity of their offers over the feelings of the woman involved.
You cannot be serious in your rejection.
I might wonder why, with so little effort and civility, I'm rejected.
Mr. Collins's proposal is defined by absurd self-importance and social calculation. He is convinced he is doing Elizabeth a favour, and he doesn't bother to disguise the belief. Darcy's first proposal, while more emotionally charged, is steeped in a similar presumption. He lays out the many reasons he should not marry Elizabeth, her lower status, her family's lack of connections, and then expects her to be moved by the fact that he has chosen to overlook them. There is no sense that he has taken her perspective into account, much like Mr. Collins. Darcy believes the honour of his offer should eclipse any objections Elizabeth might have. Elizabeth's rejections of both proposals are equally telling. She rebukes Mr. Collins with incredulous humour. She rebukes Darcy with passionate anger. The emotional stakes are higher, but the core reaction is the same. Both men have failed to truly see her. While the first proposal is filled with confessions of his love, he can't resist pointing out how degrading the match is.
Declaring myself thus, I am fully aware that I will be going expressly against the wishes of my family, my friends, and I hardly need add my own better judgment.
It's passionate, but it's framed by a mindset of superiority and expectation. The second proposal, on the other hand, is pared down, gentle, and marked with deference. That one line.
My affections and wishes are unchanged. But one word from you will silence me on this subject forever.
Is all the more powerful for its restraint. He's no longer trying to persuade her or assume he knows what's best for her. Instead, he gives her full control over the moment, offering his love without demand. It's in this second proposal that Darcy shows the depth of his growth. This time, there's no entitled rhetoric, no assumptions about Elizabeth's gratitude, no listing of his social sacrifices. He speaks with humility and without pressure. He allows her to choose freely, fully aware that he is no longer owed anything by virtue of his status.
My feelings are so different. In fact, they are quite the opposite.
This quiet, respectable proposal stands in stark contrast not only to his own earlier attempt, but to Mr. Collins's tone-deaf performance. Through this contrast, Jane Austen makes clear that Darcy's arc is not just about learning to love, but also about learning to listen, to recognise that Elizabeth has her own mind, her own will, her own authority to decide her future, and that it's not his place to assume that she will accept just because he asks. Even once Darcy has fallen irrevocably in love with Elizabeth, he's not blind to the realities of her family. It's not simply a matter of wealth or status, it's a matter of sense, decorum, and the kind of company one is expected to keep for life. For a man as private and watchful as Darcy, marrying into the Bennet household would not be a decision made lightly. His interactions with Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, and by contrast with the Gardiners, offers us a quietly revealed look at how he negotiates the divide. Mrs. Bennet, for all her comedic absurdity, is clearly a source of mortification to both Elizabeth and Darcy, and it's safe to assume that Darcy, having spent years in the carefully ordered and restrained world of Pemberley and his social equals, would find her unfiltered outbursts and incessant matchmaking deeply uncomfortable, perhaps even unpalatable. But tellingly, he never once confronts her or makes her a villain in his own narrative. He simply absorbs the reality of her and chooses to love Elizabeth anyway. And that choice is a reflection not just of affection, but of humility. Mr. Bennet is more complicated. While Darcy might share a certain dry wit with him, he surely cannot help but notice Mr. Darcy's passivity, his detachment, and the irony of a father so neglectant with the future of his 5 daughters. And yet, Mr. Bennet's approval at the end...
I could not have parted with you to anyone less worthy, Lizzie.
...is perhaps the most moving endorsement Darcy could receive. It is as though Mr. Bennet, so often hands-off, recognises something in Darcy's moral fibre, and in doing so affirms the match not just socially, but personally. The Gardiners, however, offer a welcome counterbalance, a quiet oasis of sense and civility. Their presence during Elizabeth's visit at Pemberley is arguably a turning point.
Would you do me the honour of introducing me to your friends?
Certainly.
Darcy's gracious reception of them and his warmth towards them at Lambton tells us something essential. He sees in them the qualities he values most: integrity, respectability, and thoughtfulness.
Responsibility is mine. I must have it, sir. I shall not give way.
The Gardiners are, in a way, the social and moral anchor that allows him to reframe his perception of Elizabeth's background. All of this paints a portrait not of a man who simply overcomes pride, but of someone who reassesses people. Darcy is not disdainful by default, he's cautious, and while that caution can come across as aloofness or arrogance, it is in fact part of the character who prizes genuine worth over appearance and who ultimately proves capable of deep change without compromising his core. That perhaps is the most radical transformation of all. The truth is, Elizabeth is our compass through the story. So it's easy to focus on how she is affected by Darcy. She's not just the recipient of change, she's the catalyst for it. And what's even more compelling is that she's completely unaware of the power in this until much later. Darcy doesn't change because Elizabeth asks him to or demands it. He changes because she exists. I'll let that sink in for a minute. He changes because she exists. Think about that when you rewatch the adaptations. Because she challenges him, sees through him, embarrasses him, holds him accountable, and still retains a dignity that makes him want to be worthy of her. That's what makes the second proposal so devastatingly gentle. No pride, no assumptions. You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you becomes one word from you will silence me forever. He's laid himself bare, and in that moment, Elizabeth sees the man he is, not the one she believed he was. Her realization likely began much earlier, possibly when she read his letter, certainly when she saw Pemberley and heard the accounts of him from Mrs. Reynolds. But it's in this second proposal, I think, that the truth settles in fully. Not only is this man capable of love, but he has loved her into becoming the woman who can see it.
Dearest, loveliest Elizabeth.
And when he finally says, dearest, loveliest Elizabeth, it's not just romantic, it's intimate, natural, earned. He says her name not as a societal partner, but as a man utterly at peace in vulnerability. And that is perhaps the first moment she truly knows the depth of his transformation and her own. In the end then, Mr. Darcy is not simply transformed by love, but refined through it. Love does not dismantle his reserve, it softens its edges. His pride is not vanquished, but transfigured into quiet dignity, earned through self-awareness and meaningful action. Through Elizabeth, he is challenged to confront the limits of his guarded worldview, and in raising to the challenge, he becomes a man not just capable of love, but worthy of it. Jane Austen's brilliance lies not in delivering a sudden or dramatic reversal, but in orchestrating a subtle evolution, one that honours Darcy's integrity while allowing him to grow beyond his initial failings. His journey is not one of sweeping gestures, but of deliberate steps, an honest letter, a changed manner, a silent intervention. Each marks a movement towards humility, empathy and grace, and eventually a walk through the mist, if you're watching Darcy through the eyes of Keira Knightley's Elizabeth. So Mr. Darcy's arc is not merely romantic, it's redemptive. He is not rewritten, but revealed. In peeling back the layers of his character, Austen invites us to consider that true virtue is not a matter of perfection, but of perseverance. And in Mr. Darcy, she offers not just a romantic hero, but a deeply human one, flawed, striving, and ultimately transformed by the quiet, insistent force of truth and love. And so I invite you to rewatch Pride and Prejudice and take another look at Darcy. I may be off the mark, but if you watch it with what I've said in mind, I guarantee you'll see a new side of the story. You'll be on Darcy's side from the moment he appears on the screen. You'll know his secrets and you'll understand his self-preservation. The very talented Jane Austen has given us a truly deep character with much to understand. And I think it's for us to peel back the layers, not to see what Jane Austen was hiding, but to know all along that she had a backstory well planned out when she introduced Darcy to the page. So that's it then. One more video to go in the series of my character analysis, and that is of course Eliza Bennet. I hope you'll stay tuned for that. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. May I remind you to hit the like, always very good for the channel, and perhaps even subscribe if you haven't already, and hit the share button, because you know that old adage, sharing is caring. That was my take on Mr. Darcy. Perhaps you got something from it. Thank you so much for watching. See you in the next video.